Hi there, I'm Miss Haley with the Huntsville-Madison County Public Library, and today for our craft I'm going to show you how to make paper beads. Paper beads are really fun to make. They're super simple and pretty cheap, which is always nice. So for this craft you're going to need some toothpicks. You're going to need some Mod Podge. You do not have to use Mod Podge. You can in fact actually use Elmer's glue for this, but Mod Podge just works a little bit better. And it's more likely to dry clear, which is, nice to not have like this white sheen on everything. But you can totally use a glue, just saying. So some Mod Podge. You're going to need, I'm using matte Mod Podge, by the way, but you can use glossy. It just depends on what look you want your beads to have. So if you want your beads to be shiny, use a gloss. I am using a matte finish because I want my color to show through more than I want them glossy. You're also going to need a pair of scissors to cut your strips of paper. You're going to need something to rest your beads on while they are drying. I like to use a styrofoam cup. I do not buy styrofoam. This is leftover. We've had one set of styrofoam cups at the library since I started working here, and I am slowly but surely using them for crafts. I got a fresh one for you guys today rather than my one I usually use for this, which is covered in holes. But I try not to buy styrofoam because you cannot recycle it. So don't buy it. If you don't have styrofoam at home, just set it on a plate. It will be fine. You could set it across a cup. You can do all sorts of different things, but don't go and buy styrofoam. But if you have some, it's really good for this because you can just stab a toothpick in there and let it dry. But yeah, so styrofoam cup. You will also need a paintbrush, preferably a paintbrush that you do not care about anymore because you're going to get it covered in glue, and it is a little harder to wash that out and have the same brush that you went in with. So don't use a nice brush for this. You can definitely clean a brush thoroughly after using Mod Podge with it, but just to be on the safe side, I always recommend using either a brush dedicated to Mod Podging or a brush that you just don't care about anymore. This one has seen a lot of abuse, if you can see that. And it's been used a lot, and it's kind of at the end of its life anyway. It's all jaggedy, and it doesn't really hold a shape anymore. So we're going to be using this brush today. And then you're going to need some paper. So I am using leftover scrapbook paper. I have all these scrapbook paper scraps. If you watch this channel at all, you know I do a lot of paper crafting. So we are going to be using these today. They are very thin scrapbook paper. It is not really very much heavier than a normal piece of paper would be. So it is not the thick cardstock kind. That is important. You don't really want to use the thick cardstock kind for this. You need that flexibility. You can also use magazine paper, which is often what I use when I do this. In fact, it's usually what I use when I do this. I will get a magazine that somebody donated to the library and nobody wants, and we will tear it up, cut pieces on it. I'll find colors that I like, and I'll cut it out and use that. So if you don't have scrapbook paper at home, that is fine. Find an old magazine, make sure nobody cares about it anymore, and you can totally use that too. And I think those look actually really, really cool when they are like that. But if you have some scrapbook paper scraps, go ahead and use them. I do recommend using scraps for this. You're cutting very thin strips. You don't really need a whole piece of scrapbook paper. So just keep that in mind, but pick whatever you want in colors that you like. The pattern is not super duper going to show through, but the colors will. So just keep that in mind when you're picking. Another thing you're going to want is a set of, a guide for your paper bead rolling. So this is the guide I'm using. It's the guide I've used for ever and ever. I got it from the internet. If you Google paper bead shapes, you will find all sorts of different ones. These are by no means all that you can do. These are just some of the more common ones. I usually don't do this one. I find that one very hard to roll. So I usually either do that if I'm really wanting to get fancy, or I'll do one of these. The thing that you need to be aware of when you're rolling is you tend to want to roll so that everything is centered, which works fine if you're doing this shape or one of these shapes. But if you're doing this shape where you want the end to be more narrow and the other end to be more thick, you need to make sure you're rolling along that side and you're not deviating any into the center, or you're going to wind up with a slightly odd shape. And you still might like that shape, that's fine, but just be aware of that. So this is the guide I'm using today. I'm not making all of these today. I'm probably just going to make a couple for you. I'm probably going to make one of these and one of these for you guys today. So to start out with, you're going to grab a piece of paper, and I like to cut it into a strip. It will be however wide you cut your strip is how wide your bead is going to be. So I'm going to do, it's about 1 inch. I'm not doing anything perfect. If you really, really want, say, a perfect cylinder, you can use a paper cutter to measure it out. Because, yeah, that is a little more narrow on the end than it is on the top. I'm going to actually cut it a smidge smaller, just because that's a little wider than I think I want it. It's a little wider than 1 inch, really. That's probably more like 1 inch. So I could still use this, and I probably will still use this to make a very small bead or cylinder bead. So keep in mind, you really don't need a lot of paper. This right here can be a bead as well. So I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to do this one. So now I'm going to do the same thing. This is going to be a cylinder because it's just one straight line. So that would be like this one. I'm going to cut the same thing to start with, and this one's easier because I have a pattern I can line up with, assuming, of course, that this side is straight. It looks straight, though. So I'm just going to cut along my pattern, and I will know that that line is straight, unless they printed the pattern weird, which, you know. So now what you're going to do is you're going to cut it into a taper. So find your center and cut to that point. So there's my center. I most definitely started out weird. I'm not good at this. And then I'm going to do the same thing over on this side. I'm going to cut from that center point, up, 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 to that edge. So mine is wonky. I'm going to straighten this side up a little bit because that is super duper wonky. It may be easier to start at the wider end and work your way into a point. That's probably easier. But there we go. It worked out in the end. And you can totally save some of these scraps to make beads. They might come out in a weird shape. Actually, that one is pretty tapered. So I'm just going to cut that one little oddness off and set that one aside for a small bead as well. A smaller one, the smaller you get, so the tapered triangle will get you sort of an oval bead, and the smaller you go in terms of width, the smaller your bead will go, and it'll actually get a little bit rounded. So yeah, play with your sizes. They don't have to all be this long. That'll just depend on the thickness of your bead. So the longer your paper is, the thicker your bead will be. The shorter your paper is, the thinner your bead will be. And that can be a look as well. If you want a really thin cylinder or something, you can just go with a shorter piece of paper. You just don't want to go too short because you do need to wind it and Mod Podge it. So those are our two sizes, and I might do something with that paper later. But we're going to start Mod Podging. So I'm going to open this, maybe. Oh my, it might be glued shut. There we go. Open up my Mod Podge, and I'm probably, a lot of times I would pour a little bit off into a container, but I'm probably just going to dip straight in since I'm only using Mod Podge today. And our toothpicks, get our toothpicks ready. So to start out, you're actually not going to start with any Mod Podge. We'll start with our straight one. You're going to start out by taking your paper towards the tip and putting your toothpick towards the tip of that paper and folding it over really tightly, rolling it. And you're going to start super, super tight. You're going to start rolling it. And so you want to roll it a couple times really tightly. If you're really loose, start over. It can take some practice to get that initial roll, since we're working on such a small little toothpick here. But once you've rolled it a couple times, you're going to start adding some Mod Podge to it. And you just want to really make sure that you're keeping a tight roll throughout this whole process. So you're going to get a little Mod Podge on your brush, brush it on, and roll that up. Be careful that your toothpick doesn't try to slip out. Mine just tried to slip because it's very hard to get it perfectly tight around there. In fact, you don't want it super tight because you do want that thing to come out again. So you're going to just keep rolling and keep adding Mod Podge. You're just painting it on there. Don't go super thick. If you go really thick, it will squish out. And you don't really want it to do that. Make sure you're staying centered in your roll. Oop, I'm getting off. And just keep rolling. And you don't have to add Mod Podge constantly. You can roll a little bit dry. And my roll is getting a little loose. Again, make sure you keep it tight. Paint on some more Mod Podge. Roll, roll, roll. This bead is going to be a pretty thick cylinder. Since I started with such a long piece of paper, I might even normally stop there with that length. But that was probably a 12-inch long piece of paper. So we're going to have a pretty thick bead, but that's okay. You just can play with it and find what you like. And if you wanted to stop, you could just cut it right there. That is an option you have. Just try to cut a straight line. Keep rolling. I'm getting a little off. And it takes some practice to get a perfectly straight roll. So trying to be kind to yourself, don't get frustrated. Most beads will look cool no matter what you do when you roll them. They'll still look pretty good. So I'm going to roll dry for a little bit, and when I get here towards this end, I'm going to coat the entire end in Mod Podge, but a thin layer. I'm spreading it out. I'm not really slathering it or anything, but I am making sure the entire end is wet. And your hands are going to totally get covered in glue during this process, you guys. It is unavoidable. Just know that it's okay if your hands are covered in glue by the time you're done. That is normal. Okay. So, yeah, my cylinder is not perfect. That's okay. So now that I have gotten, shift that to the side a little bit. That's kind of weird. There we go. So now that I've gotten this cylinder, this is definitely longer than I would typically want my to be. You can see how thick that was. I would maybe recommend a 7-inch piece of paper if you want slightly thinner. But if you like the thicker beads too, that is fine. It just, the longer your paper, the thicker your beads are going to be. Once you have it fully rolled, you're going to coat the outside with, I like to get a little bit on there and then wipe my brush off so that it's pretty dry, and spread that around. You want a pretty thin layer, because if you do it too thick, you will have, even with Mod Podge, a sort of white cast to your bead. And you don't really want that. So make sure you're spreading it around. I like to get my end a little bit. I like to come get this end a little bit. Just really spread that glue around. And then you are going to set it aside to dry. I'm just going to stab it right there, and it's going to dry on that. So that was my cylinder. Based on how thick that bead is, I think I want my other beads to be a little smaller. Maybe that will be my centerpiece bead since it's big, but that is a little thicker than I typically like my beads to be. So what I'm going to do on this guy is I'm going to cut off about 2 inches. That's probably 8 inches, maybe a little more. So we're gonna start with a slightly shorter piece for my my oval bead, which I'm using a triangle shape to get. So for this bead, I want to roll so that this point winds up in the center. This is, I think, probably the easiest and most forgiving shape to roll. If you're a little off here or there, it doesn't matter as much. You're not going to be able to tell as much as you can with, say, the cylinder bead or the side triangle bead. So I just like that a little bit better. I will probably make 2 this size so that they can go on either side. So you can start planning your necklace or bracelet, whatever you're going to make with these. You can make a lot of different shapes with them and just start planning it out. It can be whatever you want. It could be a keychain, it could be a bracelet, a necklace, whatever you want it to be. So we're going to start this the same way. We're going to put our toothpick at the end of the paper. And we are going to roll that paper over. We're going to start rolling our toothpick in and down the paper, trying to keep it as tight as we can keep it and as even. And I just broke my toothpick. Okay. Hopefully it'll last. If you break your toothpick, you guys, you can either start over if you're really close to being done, or if it's loose enough, once you've rolled it a little bit, you can slip it out and slip another one in there. I do recommend keeping it on the toothpick, though, until it's dry. That way you make sure that there is a hole in the center of your bead. Otherwise, it's not a bead, is it? And that you can string those beads later on with a piece of string or thread. So we are going to roll a couple more rolls, and we're going to start adding our Mod Podge. It's the exact same process that we did for our other bead. It's just a different shape. So we're going to paint some Mod Podge down there, really spread it out. And we're going to keep rolling. And if you're having a hard time rolling, you can do it this way too. I just find that harder to do for me because I tend to actually accidentally unravel it and it doesn't stay as tight. But I've seen plenty of people do it that way and have a perfect bead come out at the end. So find the process that works for you. For me, it helps for me to just roll it along. But that might not be what works best for you. And that is okay. So you can see like at the start, it's almost still more cylindrical. But as we start getting more narrow, to this narrow edge, it will start getting a little bit more oval shaped. Right. So I rolled dry for a little bit, and on this tip there, I'm going to cover the tip with my Mod Podge. You can see it's starting to be more of an oval as I roll it. If you did an even longer thin tip, it would even be more ovular rather than thicker on the end. If you just go really, really thin from the get-go. Start with a thick and then just really quickly go to the thinner. You'll get that shape, even more of an oval shape. So now that I have the bead rolled, it's still dry on the outside, so we want to fix that. We want to glue all over the outside. Otherwise, those edges of the paper can catch on things and it won't be sealed. So it won't be super usable and wearable. I'm sure you could use it for something, but not really for jewelry. So we're going to coat it in Mod Podge. Make sure you get those ends. Mine is spinning along there. I'm gonna have to hold it still a little bit. You really want it coated in Mod Podge, but not so thick again that you see white. You want it super, super thin. You'll see a little bit of white no matter what because it is, white. But it'll dry clear. But if you have a really thick spot where you can't see the color through it, spread that out because you will wind up with a weird little white patch there otherwise. So that is my oval bead. And we're going to set it aside to dry. So you guys can just keep doing this. You keep making beads until you have however many you need. And then once they are dry, it takes a while. It takes a couple hours at least for them to dry. I usually leave mine overnight even, but an hour or two and they'll be dry. You can string them up on string or yarn, really, really thin yarn, really, really thin yarn, or thread even, embroidery thread works. Whatever you have on hand, you can string them up and you can make jewelry out of your paper beads. And I hope you guys have fun with this, getting your hands all messy. It's super fun to do. And I hope you join us again soon for another craft. Thank you.